Hello and welcome to the Dublin Book Festival Snug. I'm Aoife Barry and I'm from the journal.ie, and I'm delighted to be chatting with the former president, Mary McAleese, who's here with us in the Snug this evening. Hi Mary, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, and you?
I'm great, thanks. And it's so great to be chatting to you. I am. I think we're all in the spare bedrooms these days. You look like you've got an office, so there you've got a nice dedicated space.
I'm at my dining table. I'm at one end of my dining table.
I think it's trying to make the backgrounds look, okay. It's half the job of doing the interviews these days. And I'm delighted to be chatting to you because it's about your memoir, which is it's here in the video, but people pick it up the proper way around in shops, and it's called Here's the Story. Now, congrats on bringing it out. We'll get chatting about the memoir, but I wanted to ask first, how has this year been for you? Because it's just been such a strange time for a lot of people. How have you been dealing with, the year that is 2020?
I've just been putting up with it, really, basically, doing what I'm told, when I'm told, in the places that I'm allowed to go to, and just putting up with it, because I'm not stuck in a small apartment, with children who had to be homeschooled. I'm not stuck. I wasn't cocooning. I mean, I'm not yet over 70, but getting there. All of that. I have, until recently, I didn't have anybody belonging to me. My son and son-in-law both had COVID, but we're not desperately ill with it, thankfully. But until very recently, I had nobody close to me who ended up in hospital with COVID. But unfortunately, one of my friends is now in intensive care. So that brings it home to you. I've nothing to complain about. Like Martin and I, we live on North Roscommon on a small farm on the edge of the Shannon. The Shannon flows through the front garden. We had the company of ducks and swans and beautiful scenery, and we have great neighbours, and we live in a beautiful environment close to the town of Carrick-on-Shannon, which is, one of the most beautiful towns in the, if not the most beautiful town on the Shannon. And so we have nothing to complain about. We just get on with it. And I felt that was an important thing to do, that people who can get on with it should. Because there are so many people, obviously, who are worried about jobs and worried about their future, and also worried about relationships, not able to see their mum or their dad. Particularly people is coming home to me this particular week now, with a good friend who is very ill, critically ill in hospital, and none of us can get to see him. That's really hard. That's really hard.
Yeah, it really, it's a tough thing to, see people suffering and you not to be, able to go there physically. It's such a strange time.
Exactly. There's something about even just touching a hand of a person who's even semi-conscious, or unconscious. Just to hope there is something. I think that's one of the things we're learning through these days, is the extent to which we are energized by contact with other people, and how much we need that, how important it is in our lives, how we take it for granted because it is so every day. And when it's removed from us, when we don't have it, it's easy just to almost disappear into yourself. And that's not good. That's not healthy. I think it's worrying, the level of anxiety these months have created. And the fact that we just can't see a way out of them yet. We keep hoping, obviously, that there will be an answer and it will come soon, but there's no certainty of that. So I think the uncertainty it feeds people's anxieties. I have nothing to be anxious about. My mum is almost 90. She lives in Northern Ireland, where unfortunately COVID is just out of control currently. And she's been very good, about doing all the right things. But you're just always aware that things can go wrong, and it's awful, again, not to be able just to jump into the car and go up and see her as I would normally have done. I think I've seen her. I've been in her home twice in the last since March.
So a lot of it feels like, which kind of ties into your memoir, because a lot of your memoir is about very tough things that you've gone through, as well as great experiences you've had. But it feels like you've probably learned a lot of lessons over the years about how to deal with things when they go bad, or when you don't have control over the world around you? Like, are you able to kind of tap into a reservoir of something that you've had over the years, or you've built up over the years to deal with all
right,
that now?
actually, that I don't know whether it's an innate thing or something you learn through life, but I do have fairly deep levels of resilience. I'm kind of conscious that not everybody can tap into those same levels of resilience. You know, it's and possibly it's genetic. I remind myself of my grandmother, you know, who had 11 children, lived in a 2-up, 2-down house in Ardoyne. So often, if I, you know, if I put it like this, if I'm ever tempted to give in to self-pity, I just think of her and give myself a shake and move on. I also just think that, you know, it would be an awful thing really now for the likes of Martin and I to have any cause for complaint, because our lives are not deeply afflicted in the way that so many other people's lives are. But I think I have learned, you know, I've learned over time, I know what things to be patient about, and I also know what things to be impatient about. And I think that's probably no harm.
Yeah, definitely knowing the difference, having the wisdom to know the difference between
exactly.
those is probably good. Exactly. So take me back to deciding to write the memoir. You've written books before, so this isn't the first time that you've written, and indeed people will discover you've written poetry since you were a very young child as well. But when did you which I'd love to read more of, because there's little bits in it. But when did you decide the time was right to write the memoir, sit down and go back over your whole life and put a narrative together around that? When did you decide that?
Well, it was almost an accident, because the publishers approached me to ask me would I write Penguin Random House. Brendan Barrington approached me, and Michael McLaughlin asked me would I write it. At the time, I was in the middle of writing a fairly significant book on children's rights and obligations and canon law, which will obviously be in every home in the country. And, you know, it's one of those books that, you know, there's about 2 inches of text and about 10 inches of footnotes. And that I've been working on that really for the last number of years. It's a major work in a field that is new. And it was important to me to write that. That for me was, if you like, a legacy document in many ways. The kind of thing that I hope would be explored by scholars in the future and unpacked by scholars. But I had to get that done, and I finished that and got that published by Brill, the International Children's Rights Publishers, last year. And so when I had that done, and it seemed that it more or less around the same time, Penguin Random House said to me, would you not think about writing a memoir? And I thought, well, yeah, probably now is a good time. I have the time freed up. I have that book done. And so yes, it seemed right. And not luckily, but then COVID hit, you know, and I had time, a lot of time.
So you could really, because I can imagine.
I get stuck into it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I can imagine that before you had that free time, trying to squirrel away the time to work on a memoir can be quite difficult, but you were actually then able to give days to it, I'd imagine.
It was really difficult to try and do it in bits and starts and bits and pieces with other things coming in on top of it. So in a sense, with the book on canon law, you know, on children's rights behind me, and with COVID in front of me, and those months stretching out, that when we had to stay home, we could only go like 2 kilometers, and then 5 kilometers. You know, it was right, and take a walk. Basically, that was life.
And how much, like when you were writing about, particularly going back to your childhood, how much of it did you remember straight away, and how much of it did you have to maybe sit down with your brothers and sisters and say, what happened here, or do you remember this, or is this right? Like, what was the process like to uncover a lot of the memories? Or do you have a really good memory and it was very easy for you?
I have a reasonable memory, though not terrific all the time. I have a reasonable memory. I relied a lot on my own memory and my own diaries. And so some things I probably got right, and some things I probably got very wrong. A couple of things, you know, I rang my mum about, and rang one of my sisters about, because I'm the oldest of the family. So in terms of memories, I have probably a greater store of memories about a lot of the stuff than they, like, for example, my youngest brother wouldn't remember us, I don't think, much about losing our home. He was only a baby really at the time. Whereas I remember all of it. And my sister, who's next to me, she would remember a lot of it. And as you go down the line, I suppose the memory would be different. depending on the age of the kids, because during that time, you know, you put a lot of effort into trying to spare the younger children from the worst of it. And in fairness, also they all have their own stories, you know. And I wouldn't like to tread on other people's stories. So I just told my own story, basically. Checked a few facts, all right. Probably should have checked a few more, but yes, that's what I did.
And at the start of it, you write particularly about Ardoyne, and what I thought was really interesting is you saying, you know, the media talked about the Ardoyne and created this idea around the Ardoyne area, and you're bringing the reader in and you're saying this is what it was really like for us living here, you know, not just the you know, tough elements, but the positive elements, the community elements, I think is particularly what comes through, as well as all of the very hugely difficult things you went through. It sounds like it was hugely important to you to kind of, you know, set the record straight, I suppose, about an area that's been written about by a lot of people who didn't have any experience of living there and who didn't know what it was like to grow up there.
Yes, and unfortunately, during the Troubles, from the Troubles onwards, Ardoyne became, say, known as the Ardoyne. I have to say, an expression that brings me out in spots, and because I never lived in the Ardoyne, I just lived in Ardoyne. And it's funny, just even putting that word "the" in front of it suddenly made it other and out there and different and excluded. And I always, and also, of course, this was a terminology that was really invented by the media, and indeed by journalists, many of whom, you know, didn't know Ardoyne or passed through it, you know, on the way to a riot and out of it again, or got their, you know, their information feed from other journalists, as I discovered. My father had a pub that was frequented by a lot of journalists, and I noticed that a lot of them took their stories from one another, and so and that bothered me greatly. So yes, there were. I felt it was important just to tell the story of our experience of living there, of what it was like, and how it descended into madness as it did, and how it was let descend into madness by people who had it in their power to stop those things and to change those things, to make Northern Ireland a place of equal citizenship, but who didn't do that. So, and then to tell the story onwards of trying then, having grown up in a ridiculously dysfunctional environment, how you make sense of that as a youngster. I mean, I was a teenager growing up, and I think honestly, Aoife, one of the benefits I had was because I was female. I worry that if I had been male at my age and in those circumstances, that I would have been a sitting target for paramilitaries, because things were happening that made people angry and frustrated and vengeful. And so many of the young people around me, both Protestant and Catholic, were sucked into paramilitary organizations. It was mainly the young men. It's always the young men, isn't it, who go to war, unfortunately. And they get sucked into that. And I was fortunate that I didn't. And I was also fortunate that none of my brothers and sisters did, thank God. I also think that what you hear at home matters too, you know, how your parents react to these things, how they educate you about these things, that also matters. So I regard myself as fortunate that I was able to just to be a step back from the fray, as it were, though in it at the same time, and to try and work out in my head, what am I going, you know, what am I asked to do here? What am I asked to do with my life here? And then I was very fortunate that I met Martin, my husband, whom, you know, we're just saying this morning, we started going out together when we were 18.
Wow.
And we'd known each other when we were 17, but we started going out together when we were 18. And he's of that age also, of the young men who could have been sucked into paramilitarism, but decided absolutely coherently not to be, because we had other choices. We had the chance of going to university, we had the chance of entering professions. But it wouldn't be enough, it wouldn't have been enough, I think, for either of us just to do that and to turn our backs on our communities. But we both felt very strongly that we were, in a sense, almost called, you know, to get involved in cross-community endeavour in trying to straighten out the dysfunction that allowed us. I mean, he lived in a Protestant area, so did I. He had a very different experience in his area. It was a very strong loyalist area, didn't have any Protestant friends. I grew up in a Protestant area where I had nothing but Protestant friends. So we had both quite different experiences living in the same city. I had the experience of living next, right beside a wonderful family that we grew up with. My sister was bridesmaid to one of the girls in that family. And one of the young men went out one night. He joined a loyalist organization after the Birmingham bombings. You could say inspired by, frustrated by, made angry by the Birmingham bombings, and he went out and he killed 4 Catholics in one night, and then he killed a Protestant man who happened to be walking past the chapel, our local chapel, because he thought he was a Catholic just because he was walking past the chapel. Oh. And then you look at the consequence of that man who died, the poor Protestant man, we knew him, he was a local man. And my cousin Paddy, God rest him, had a little shop, little newsagent. And he heard the shooting. It happened just across the road from his little shop. And he ran across and found the man dying, and made the same blunder as the shooters, thought that he must have been a Catholic, and whispered into his ear, the act of contrition that we in the Catholic tradition say. And anyway, the man died in his arms, so that was that. And he was desperately, really very, very distressed, traumatized by that, you would say. Anyway, many years later, the man who died, he had one daughter, and his wife tragically had early onset Alzheimer's. The daughter knew nothing about the circumstances of her father's death, but many years later, when she was, by then also a middle-aged lady and with a family, she went, she discovered from the historical inquiries team the file on her father, and she discovered my name on it. Why? Because many years later, doing a radio program, I had been asked about the murders and the killings that really, that just broke my heart still, of which there were many, including on the morning of our wedding when 2 of our friends were murdered. And I said that I mentioned this man's name, the stupidity of his death, because I knew the man who killed him. I knew the man who died. I knew the man who was with him when he died. Anyway, that lady, that daughter, came to see me in the Aoife, and I told her that my cousin was, who had been with her father as he died, had whispered the act of contrition. And I said, I'm terribly sorry, that he always thought, oh, maybe this is a terrible thing to have done. Maybe the Protestant family would feel very upset at him having done that, though it was done out of kindness. And she started to cry and said it was a great gift to have known that. Wow. That somebody had prepared her dad to go to heaven. And I thought that was beautiful, because at the end of the day, for me, one of the things I've learned, if nothing else, I don't know how faith ever survives religions, really. But somehow it does. And sitting there that day, we were both women with faith in the same God. We were both women who were children of the same God, and religion had kept us apart. It hadn't done much for us apart from that.
And how was it going back and revisiting those moments, when you're writing the book, where you weren't just revisiting one moment, there was many different moments like that, where there's a huge amount of emotion, where you're seeing sectarianism in action and how it affects people. How did you feel writing about these moments, seeing them all coming together and maybe seeing patterns and seeing impacts on people?
Yeah, funnily enough, you mentioned the word patterns there. On one occasion, 2 men came to our home with machine guns and emptied the contents of the machine guns through our windows. Luckily, they were Protestant loyalists who didn't understand that on the feast of the 8th of December, your mother drags you out of bed to first mass in our house, and we had the lights on, and they shot into all the rooms with lights on. Dark December morning, but we were out at first. My mother had taken the other children out to first mass, so luckily they didn't kill anybody. But many years later, and when I was looking back over the pattern of just the deaths that had occurred before that and after that, I was able to work out who the shooters were.
Gosh,
isn't that extraordinary?
Yeah,
I was able to work out who the shooters were. Both of them dead now, killed in internecine warfare between loyalists. But isn't that extraordinary? And so, look, revising them again for the purposes of writing, I don't think I would describe it as in any sense cathartic.
Right.
Far from it. I would regard it at times as convulsive. There were times when I just had to stop writing.
Really?
Yes, just had to. Like, I think particularly revisiting some of the deaths, like the morning of our wedding. We have never been able to celebrate our wedding. We tried once and it didn't really work. We just can't do it on the day. You know, we can't celebrate our wedding anniversary on the day. It's just way too painful. And doing that again, going back over that, and in particular remembering the happy days when the two guys, Tony and Miles O'Reilly, who were murdered on the day of our wedding, we were actually supposed to have our wedding reception in their restaurant. And it was Tony's, because we wanted a small wedding, but it ended up being, you know, my mother wanted more people. And so, and in fact, it was Tony said to me, and I still remember him saying, your man never put up with that. And so anyway, we I just kept remembering all the days when I was younger than both of them, and I was the oldest of 9. They were the youngest of 13, or the younger ones of 13, and their house was just an open door for us. We ran in and out of it. They always had 3pence or 6pence for us, and we played cards and had a laugh. And I would have loved to have had older brothers, and I fantasized that these were my older brothers. And they acted like they were my older brothers. They were so kind and kindly. They were the kindest people. And so that was, you know, going back over that, I found hard. And yet, having said that, it also, if you like, it raised up in me something inside me, a sense of gratitude that I had those memories, that it wasn't all about death and destruction and misery. And particularly going back over the street that I lived in when my parents moved into, and were the first Catholic to live in this particular street, where all our friends were great, we had great mates, great friends. And great protectors too, because the local park was not a place that Catholic kids could go to safely. So our friend Florence, who was Protestant, she was like a Rottweiler. She really was. I mean, she just protected us. Anybody came near us. So it was the first place I heard the expression Fenian. I never knew
in a playground.
Yeah, in the playground from a Protestant. Protestant taught me, or told me, the expression, shouted at me that we were Fenians, and then tried to attack us. But sure, look, Florence was better than any Rottweiler, believe me. And the awful thing was that in many instances, these were people that she went to school with. So she had to face them in the schoolyard and face them down. Boy, was she tough. And my sister was her bridesmaid when she married a Scottish soldier in Feetville Barracks in Lisburn. Now, for Catholic girls to be bridesmaids to Scottish soldiers' weddings, you know, was to invite being tarred and feathered by your own crowd, incidentally.
Yeah.
And we did all that, and to heck with the politics of it, and the, you know, and the cultural baggage that would have held you back from doing it. We just did it, and you know, I'm really very grateful for all those things. Revisiting all those things and putting them together. You're right. I mean, there was I was very grateful looking back that I'd had those experiences. Like at Florence's wedding, for example, the Reverend Sidney Callaghan, the local minister from the Shankle Road church that they belonged to, he was a wonderful man and a great ecumenist. And he observed when he was making his comments at the wedding that that the one person he knew from the congregation was me, because I was more often in his church than his congregants, because I would go with Florence. And then whenever I'd be walking up and down the Shankle Road doing shopping, because we lived at the top of the Shankle Road, I often ran into him and had chats with him, and he was so pleasant. And then she would come to our chapel on a Saturday when we went to confession. She would sit at the back, you know, watching and observing all that was going on. And she figured out from first principles that one of the priests gave out sweets in confession. So we changed our allegiance based on her local intelligence. And she was terrific. So things like that, I look back on them with great gratitude that we had those experiences, because Martin didn't. He lived over in East Belfast, and he remembers going at 8 years of age being sent just round the corner by his mum to get a pot of jam, and the terror that you might be beaten up just going to get a pot of jam.
God.
You know, that's every day. You know, can you imagine? You know, like we were sent to get messages every 5 minutes because it was a Lipton supermarket and a Stewart supermarket around the corner from us, and so we were always on the road, you know, getting stuff. And it never would have occurred to me to be scared. Never, not in those days, because I always had Florence, and so you know, and so I wasn't really scared. And whereas they were terrified all the time. So you know, revising and revisiting all that gave me a deep sense of gratitude for all the good stuff that that managed to somehow distill into a goodness that somehow didn't quite redeem fully the dysfunction, because we were all impacted by the dysfunction, but it allowed goodness and a belief in goodness, and also a great belief in the power of people to change, that the decency in people. I knew that there was a power in people to change. So I was grateful for all that revisiting that through the book just allowed me to be grateful.
And all those things you talk about there too really in the book come into play during your presidency, because you're obviously heavily influenced by all of what you spoke about there to come together with that theme of building bridges and inviting people. I was so struck by your descriptions of inviting people into the Aoife who would not have wanted to be there, would not have maybe wanted to be in your company, who would not have wanted to be in somebody else's company from another part of kind of the divide. And yet you, having gone through all of that, really wanted to bring everybody together. And you also didn't do it to get media attention. I think that's what I was struck by, that you were building friendships through this building bridges theme. Can you tell me about that? About, you know, were you ever tempted to be like, come over here and look at what we're doing? We're talking to the UDA and we're bringing people in, you know, can you tell me a bit more?
Not to do that, but it had to be done with great diplomacy and sensitivity. It had to be authentic. It couldn't be, you know, it could not be about photo opportunities and spin. It could not be that, because it was about friendship building, and there had to build a friendship. You don't do it in one day. You don't do it over one cup of tea. It has to be a sustained effort. And we were about the business, Martin and myself, about building. The building bridges theme was about building a culture of good neighborliness where none had existed. Mistrust, distrust, contempt, dislike. So many of the people who came to the Aoife came for the first time across the border. And so it was important to us that they knew that we weren't doing this for the purposes just of, you know, of spin and photo op. And so we didn't go looking for attention. We knew that Northern Ireland's a small place. It's only 1.5 million people. And if we outreach to enough people, and we did it well, and we did it with integrity, and we made them welcome, and we went back to them and invited them again and again and again, and their friends, as we did, that word would get out within the community, and good people would respond. You wouldn't get everybody, you know, because there's always people who are completely dyed in the wool, but good people would respond. And honestly, even people who were very dyed in the wool, you know, in their attitudes, quite a number of them also came. And, you know, they'd say to you and my attitude was, we're not evangelizing or proselytizing on behalf of Irish nationalism. We are here to try and see, can we build a culture of good neighborliness? That's all. I don't want to turn you into an Irish nationalist or, God forbid, a Catholic. What I want to turn you into is my friend. And I want you to believe that friendship is possible, and that out of friendship can come the kind of space for dialogue that isn't raw and offensive and turns you away from each other, which had been our experience. I mean, our experience growing up was that political dialogue was desperately raw and mean and miserable. People said terrible things, and everything, and every word was like a bullet. It was like another, you know, it was like something that just reinfected the wound. We were not a people who said the calming word, the healing word, the friendly word. And that was easy in a situation where you weren't friends and you were not going to have a continuing relationship. So we felt that in developing the theme of building bridges and making it a project and bringing people to the Aoife, and indeed beyond that, you know, doing a lot of work both in the north and in terms of visits there and bringing people to interact with people of similar interests in the south, that would build a culture of good neighbourliness, which in time would allow us to sit down and talk around the hard stuff, but we wouldn't talk about the hard stuff to begin with. Yeah. We would have the cup of tea, we'd talk about kids and weather and holidays and all sorts of things that neighbours do. And if there came a time when we had to talk about the harder stuff, we hoped that we would have built up enough trust that that would be doable without breakdown, without people walking away offended. So that was what we did for 14 years. Martin sat on the phone, phoning people, and they would come. And at the very beginning, we were lucky that we had, you know, loads of Protestant friends, you know, from university days and other times, and also from growing up in Belfast, people who immediately committed to helping us, which was wonderful. We had the most wonderful man imaginable, two wonderful men from either side of the house. We had Dennis Maloney, a solicitor who worked with a lot of the paramilitaries and was very instrumental in breaking through into loyalist paramilitaries and getting them to come. We had a wonderful man called Colonel Harvey Bicker. And Colonel Harvey Bicker was a member of the Ulster Unionist Party, an elected member, elected councillor. And he wrote to me before I was elected and said, I think you're going to be elected, and if you are, I'm going to work with you. And with people like that, you know, working with you on a daily basis, they were helping to make the contacts, asking people to come for lunch or dinner or a cup of tea, feeling the pushback. You know, they got a lot of pushback initially. And then we asked them, well, just keep an eye on that now. The people who said over their dead bodies, would they come and see if over time, if we are able to establish our credentials, and the word goes out that we're decent and that we're kind and that we're hospitable and that we're not, there's no Trojan horse here. Then when you go back to those people, again, we would expect that they might be a bit less resistant to coming. And that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. And so it took the 14 years, you know, to do it. Yeah. And I think that was a project that proved to me that there's a great decency, a fundament of decency in people. And if you can tap into that, you can achieve all sorts of things.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable thinking about the different people that you were able to bring together into the Aoife. Reading about it was really remarkable. And what also really struck me that's connected, I think, to that is throughout the book, there are examples of you basically speaking truth to power, that you were able to talk to people when they did something that was wrong or that overstepped a line or that was offensive or sexist or sectarian. You know, you spoke to people at times when people really wouldn't have wanted you to stand up to those people. For people, I think some people reading the book, certainly for me, it's, you know, you kind of wonder, wow, like where does somebody get the strength and the inner belief to be able to stand up to people? How do you know, where do you get that strength from? And is it something you've always had, you know, as a young person?
Again, I think there's an innateness in it, able to stand on my hind legs and speak. And in school, that's what I was good at, was debating. It's how I met my husband. And so I was a debater. And I think that discipline of learning how to stand up and get your sea legs under you, you know, and not wobble from an early stage. Now, not everybody's interested in doing that. I don't know where that came from. I wish I did know where it came from, but I don't. But it did somewhere. And I don't know whether it was partly innate, but also then learnt. I mean, I joined the debating team. I got involved in that. I was involved very early on in the St. Vincent de Paul Society as a very young person. I set up the St. Vincent de Paul Society in my own school. I was involved in, I was always a person who, you know, joined, got involved, did things, saw things through. And I think maybe part of that too is being the oldest of 9, you know. Yeah. That you have to take responsibility for stuff too, and be responsible. And it was expected of me that I would be, and I was. And so and I've always, and also I think my heroes from very young were people who stood up. I mean, my great heroes, Dan O'Connell, Thomas More, you know. These were the people my father introduced me to. And I never was introduced to them at school. I never learned about Daniel O'Connell at school, interestingly.
Right. Yeah.
I never learned about St. Thomas More at school. But I learned from him at home, about them at home. And these were people who spoke out, spoke up, even at cost, even at cost. And so somewhere along the line, I just made that choice, you know, that it was worth speaking up and speaking out, even if it got you into bother, even if sometimes you were very wrong. You know, that you could, but to put yourself into that space and to be willing to debate it was important, very important, I think. It's too easy to be silenced in this world. There are many forces that would like to silence us. I think particularly true of women, and in particular in the church that I was brought up in, the Catholic Church that I was baptized into. You know, silence is taken as a virtue. Because we are told that by baptism, you know, we are now obliged by virtue of our baptismal promises, which incidentally were made when we were like 2 or 3 days old. But by virtue of these baptismal promises, we are now for the rest of our lives obliged to be obedient to the magisterium of the church. Well, now I know that that's just drivel and absolute nonsense. The very idea that, first of all, as a baby, that you'd be expected to take on obligations that people could hold you to for the rest of your life. What a nonsense. And the other nonsense is that even that the idea that the human right that you have to freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, could be so circumscribed for the rest of your life that somebody else would always make up your mind for you. It just strikes me as ludicrous. And in particular now, when we know just how dopey some of the members of the magisterium have been, you know, and how careless they've been of our children, how careless they've been of our rights. I think now, you know, I'm glad always that that over the years that the education that I got helped me to critique that world around me and the world that shaped me. And would have, if it could have, silenced me. You know, growing up in Belfast and growing up in Northern Ireland, there were people who wanted to silence the silence Catholics, exclude them. You know, how mean and miserable was that? But then in the church, there were voices that wanted to silence women, in particular women. Silence all the laity, but silence women in particular, so that the only voices you would hear were the voices, you know, of the male ordained. And I'm glad that I, with the help of good education, incidentally, from good nuns, that I was able to develop the critical skills to critique that, to take from it what was good, but also to point out what is unreasonable and no longer tenable.
Do you feel like a trailblazer? I mean, when it comes to maybe specifically, first of all, the church, because you're such an outspoken critic at the same time as having such a strong faith. So do you feel like a trailblazer in helping to change things and helping the church to see it needs to progress?
I don't know if I see myself as a trailblazer. I do see myself as someone who can't say nothing in the face of nonsense. And in particular, nonsense that is promoted and promulgated to 1.2 billion people in the world. Because of course, the Catholic Church is an extraordinarily powerful, influential organization. Faith systems generally are in the world. And I take an interest in all faiths, but the only one that I can really talk about with any authority is the Catholic faith, one, because I'm in it, and two, because I've made it my business to try and know it as well as I possibly can. And in 5 out of 7 people in the world identify with one of the major world religions. And I think we overlook that at our peril, because it's more than a thread, it's a deeply, deeply influential tool. The faith system. I mean, the one that I belong to has carried for 2,000 years. It carried the story of Christ, which is a very beautiful story. And I find a very appealing story. I love coming up to the Nativity and Christmas, and I love all of that. I love peace on earth. I love the great commandment to love one another. But as human beings carried that story down through 2,000 years, they also carried a lot of debris with them. The purity of that story somehow gets mixed up with the debris that becomes institution, that becomes institutionalized, that becomes clericalism, that becomes sexism, that became, unfortunately, with awful consequences, anti-Semitism, that is today, with awful consequences, homophobia. So I can't, for as long as I'm alive and able to speak, I can't say nothing in the face of that. And we're very fortunate that I'm in a generation that has the tools to speak and the strength to speak and the credentials to speak. Others didn't have that, and were cowed by false deference to authority. And I think that kind of authority nowadays no longer holds the same sway or power that it used to have. So it's easier to speak, truth to power now.
It's kind of the, inverse of the Seamus Heaney quote, whatever you say nothing. You're saying whatever you say something, stand up for.
Well, actually, he's a very good person to mention, because my favorite poem of his is the poem from the Canton of Expectation, where he describes the very change from the whatever you say nothing mode to, stand up and speak mode, because he describes in that poem what the big change that was effected in Northern Ireland at the end of the 40s and early 50s by the advent of free second level education and then the massification of third level education. And he describes his parents' generation living under high banked clouds of resignation. Can you imagine that? The silencing effect of that. How it diminished you as a person to live resigned to your situation. And then he describes the sudden change of mood that was created by the advent of education. And suddenly we had what he calls, this new generation, intelligences brightened and unmannerly as crowbars.
Wow. Very powerful. He's really a man who managed to sum up.
Has outlived its term. The future lies with what's affirmed from under. So that voice that was repressed and suppressed, that couldn't find a way to the surface, was to be the future. And he was absolutely right about that, utterly prophetic. And the brains had to be used as crowbars because there were so many obstacles to be moved. There still are, for example, in the Catholic Church. It needs those intelligences brightened and unmannerly as crowbars to be moving and removing and challenging those obstacles. Unfortunately, it doesn't have within its own systems robust forums for the kind of dialogue that needs to happen, to shift a lot of those obstacles, regrettably, which is why I probably resist the Trailblazer thing, because somehow in the church, if you speak up, you're accused of being shrill, particularly if you're a woman, you're accused of being shrill. And the truth of the matter is, we're not inside the citadel, where decisions are made. No woman is. And so you're always outside, lobbing in the missiles, hoping that they'll catch fire and that somebody will shout alarm, something has to happen here. And so by virtue of not creating a space, people on the outside of that citadel have to shout the louder. And I think that's a pity, that a dialogue has to be conducted in a way that is not dialogical, that actually a shouting match often. But unfortunately, that is the choice of those who run the church, the management structure. The management is atrocious. It's just absolutely dire. And if they were running anything else, they'd be long gone. They'd be sacked. They're so poor at management. But still, they're what we're stuck with. And until they find ways of respecting the voices that are lovingly trying to say that, you're ruining religion is killing faith. That's what it's doing. The way in which you are managing a religious body is actually killing faith. And I think that's an awful accusation, but it happens to be true.
I think that, you know, you're someone who will continue to keep speaking up about, you know, the issues that you see within the church and other institutions, as long as, you know, these issues are happening. And thank you so much for speaking to us about this memoir. There's, I mean, I could chat to you for another 4 or 5 hours about it. It's called Here's the Story, and people can buy it in the Dublin Book Festival bookshop as well. This should be, the info should be in the chat there. And just before we finish up, do we have anything else we can expect from you for the rest of the year, or do you have any other plans? I know that you did write poetry, as I mentioned. You have written fiction.
You will never see a book of my poems.
Are
Never.
you sure?
No. But no, I do have a plan. We're going to do a family cookbook. That's our Christmas present to each other.
Wow.
A family cookbook we're going to make. But actually, no, the next project is to get on paper the work that, from the beginning, the work that Martin did with the paramilitaries.
Wonderful.
Because he kept wonderful diaries. And we told part of the story in that book, in my memoir, but there's a much broader and bigger story to be told. And so we're going to start work on that. That'll be the next project.
Fantastic. We look forward to that coming out. It was wonderful to speak to you. Thanks so much, Mary McAleese, for chatting to us in the Snug.
Good luck to you. I hope the Dublin Book Festival goes really well.
Exactly. There's plenty more events happening over the weekend, so check out the website and you can catch up with more writers over the weekend.